Hello everyone and welcome back. We're going to continue our study of functions, and this time we're going to learn a new syntax for functions. Now, for a long time, the only way to get functions in JavaScript was the way that we already talked about, where you type out function, myfunc, and put your code in there. Return my code here. And then you would call it my function or my func like that. Now that was the way it was for a long time. However, in ES6 they put out arrow functions. Arrow functions are absolutely amazing. Arrow functions are probably the most loved feature of ES6, and there's a lot of things in ES6 to love. So I'm going to show you how you can create your own arrow functions. This is a new syntax. They still work pretty much like the regular functions. There's a few caveats and there's a few differences, but they're all good differences. So I'm going to show you how you can write arrow functions and how they can make your life easier. The syntax for arrow function at first is a little bit confusing when you're used to this cut and dry old way, but once you get it down, it is so much faster, so much better. The syntax is as follows: open and close parentheses, equals, the greater than sign, and then your code block. That's the syntax for an ES6 arrow function. Inside of here you put your parameters, so you might do num, and right down here I might return num times 2. Now as of right now, this is what's called an anonymous function. It has no name, it's not stored in memory once it gets run. So right now, we don't have a use for an anonymous function, although we will have a lot of use for them later. So for right now, what you can do is const my function equals that. So this is the new syntax, and you'll notice it works the exact same. If I call my function and pass in a number, it'll return that number times 2. It'll run that code, it'll do exactly what it's supposed to do. So as I said, the new syntax is const or let, I guess theoretically you could do that, but generally you're going to do const. Your function name equals parentheses and arrow, that's why they're called arrow functions. And then you have the same curly braces you're used to. Why would we want to do this? Because this looks about the same as up here. It's actually looks like it might even be a little bit longer than it is up here. So why would we want this? Well, number one, they are faster to write. They're easier to write when you actually get down and start doing it, so they're faster. More importantly, though, they can be anonymous functions. Anonymous functions are used whenever you have something else that needs a function. We haven't gotten into those yet, but there's a lot of them like for each and map and things like that that we will get into, and you can use arrow functions for those. And those are methods that you have to put a function in as one of the inputs. So we haven't gotten into that yet, but I promise we will, and these will come in very handy there. But also, and probably most importantly, you don't have any more problems with the this keyword binding. In programming, there is generally a keyword in pretty much every language that means this thing that you're talking about. Oftentimes it's applied in classes and a little bit more advanced things than what we're using right now, but the this keyword is extremely important in JavaScript when you get a little bit more advanced. And the problem is that the old functions broke that binding. So what would happen, and again, you don't have to know this is not something we're going to cover in this class. It'll come up if you look into React or any of the front-end frameworks, this will come up a lot. But for example, if we were going to make a class and we added a method to that class called, I don't know, onClick, then you could set that, you used to have to set that using a function like this, and then after you did all that, you would have to come back and do onClick.this equals onClick.bind this. And you would have to do weird little hacky things like this to make it act right. We don't want that. We want to get rid of that. So instead, if you use arrow functions, it works out a lot better. So as of right now, I know this is kind of esoteric, this is kind of out there, and why do I care? Why does this matter? Why can't I just stick with the old functions? And technically you can just stick with the old functions, but you're gonna be behind the times. If you go out and try and get a job, using JavaScript for anything, they're going to expect that you use arrow functions for pretty much everything. They're going to expect that you understand that they're anonymous. They're going to expect that you have a foundation of this keyword and why you would use arrow functions. So, like I said, we're not really going to get into that in this course, because in this course you could use regular functions or arrow functions. I mean, it wouldn't really matter one way or the other. But because they are the new hotness and they are where JavaScript is going, and they are necessary later on if you're getting into more advanced JavaScript things, you're going to go ahead and get in the habit of doing them now. So from this day onward, all of your functions in this course will be arrow functions. I'm going to say it again. Every function in this course, for anything you submit, needs to be an arrow function. So go ahead and learn the syntax, and I'll do that again for you. The syntax is const, whatever you're going to name it, function name, equals, and it's just like you're assigning a regular variable. See? So this is just, I mean, if you were just doing a variable, you could assign this to my variable, and that would work fine. But what we're doing is we're assigning it to an arrow function. Parentheses, arrow, body. Inside your parentheses are your arguments, A, B, C, and you might console.log A, B, and return A times B times C, whatever. So you've got your code in there. If I call function name, and pass it 1, 2, 3, it console.logs 1 and 2, and returns all of them multiplied together. So we know it still works just fine. It works exactly like regular functions do. So there are a few things that you need to know about arrow functions when it comes to like variations, and depending on what type of function you're using, you can write it in a different way. For an arrow function with no parameters, so const no params equals the exact same that we've been talking about, where it's the parentheses, and then your arrow, and then your body. If you only have one parameter, one param, you don't need the parentheses. A equals return A times 2. And if I call this one param, it works fine. If you have only one parameter, you do not need the parentheses. However, if you have no parameters, or if you have 2 or more parameters, you do have to include the parentheses. So that's just kind of a shorthand that you can save yourself a couple keystrokes if you want to. Me personally, I still tend to put the parentheses on everything, just because it makes it more clear and easier to read for me personally. However, that's a personal choice I have made. Depending on who I'm coding for at the time, they may have code standards that require it to not, or they may have code standards that require it to, or they may not care. But me personally, I stick with putting it on there just to make it a little bit easier for me to read. The second variation that can be helpful is that you don't necessarily have to have the curly braces. So the way that we've learned it, const has curly equals, and then you put your curly braces here, like that, and you put your code inside here. However, if you're simply going to return something short, and it all fits on one line, you don't have to put the curly braces. So if, for example, it has, instead of has curly, we might call it no curly, and it has A and B, and I just want to return A times B, I can do it just like that. I don't have to have my brackets. I don't have to use the return keyword. Right there, done. So if I call no curly, 4 and 5, works just fine. If it all fits on the same line, then you can do it that way. However, if it does not all fit on the same line and you want to have multiple things inside of there, you need to have your curly brackets. So the question is, should I always use arrow functions outside of this class? Because in this class the answer is yes, because I told you so. Outside of this class the answer is still yes, almost. Pretty much you can use them unless you need recursion. Now we haven't talked about recursion, and we honestly won't talk about recursion. But if you want to look it up, recursion is basically where a function calls itself. This is an important concept to learn for programming in general, but like I said, we're not really going to cover it in this course. So if you need to use recursion, don't use arrow functions because they are anonymous and it can cause problems. One other time when you wouldn't want to use arrow functions is when you are adding methods to objects, but we'll talk about that in a later video. So in this video, we talked about the new syntax for creating arrow functions. We talked about how const arrow function equals, you have your open and close parentheses, your arrow, and then your curly braces to define your code block. If you're going to have parameters, you put them in here, put your code in here. If you only have one parameter, you do not have to have the parentheses. If your code fits on one line, you do not have to have the curly brackets. So, and you also don't need the return keyword. So that is a perfectly valid function. Now you can see, as we start to use these little tricks, it does start to get shorter. Instead of having to write, because if I was to write that same thing the old way, function arrow func, I would come in here and I would have to return a times 3. And you see now already on to 3 lines, and those two things do the exact same thing. Those two functions do the exact same thing. This is a lot more concise, and honestly, in my opinion, it's a lot easier to understand. The arrow function takes in a and outputs a times 3. As always, if you have any questions, comments, cries of outrage, please let me know. I'll be happy to help. Thanks.